There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Tackling Resilience Through Food Policy Council's webinar, hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. My name is Ann Palmer, and I'm a program director at the center, and I'm joined in the room by Rachel Santos and Erin Biehl. I'm going to introduce our presenters and then talk about what they'll cover today. We have 5 speakers. Becca Bartholomew, who is a consultant for food and technology program at Friends of the Earth. Erin Biehl is a senior program coordinator in the food system and public health program here with us at CLF. Natalie J. Rue is the president and CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank of Greater New Orleans in Academia. Wendy Peters-Moschetti is the director of food systems at Livable, Colorado, and a Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council member. And the last person we'll hear from is Kim Zuli, who is the Senior Vice President and Director of Research and Advisory Practice at the Initiative for Competitive Inner City. For today's webinar, I'm going to start by providing an overview of CLF and the FPN project, and then I'll turn it over to Erin and then Kim to discuss some of the basics of urban food systems resilience. After their presentations that will be setting the stage, we'll hear some specific examples of how these ideas are being implemented through municipal food procurement strategies, food bank disaster planning, and food policy council educational efforts from Becca, Natalie, and Wendy. At the end of everyone's presentations, we'll open it up for questions from you. Erin will facilitate this conversation. You're welcome to write questions in the question box on your control panel at any time during the webinar.
Awesome.
We'll also send out the materials that the speakers reference along with the slides and recording after the webinar. And we also plan to share an accompanying blog post with more examples of how cities might specifically address climate change mitigation and adaptation through their food system. All attendees are muted and will remain in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. Go one more. So the CLF is an interdisciplinary center located at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our work focuses on the intersection of diet, environment, food production, and public health, and we do that through education, research, and programs. Our education program includes a food system certificate, a high school curriculum, curriculum development. We support doctoral fellows. We also conduct research on food system issues and support other faculty members' research and collaborate with other research institutions. And in addition, we have 4 program areas. The Food Policy Networks project is one of our projects that falls under the Food Communities and Public Health program area. The goal of our project is to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to work on state, local, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do that through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials. If you're not familiar with the project, we encourage you to check out our website and sign up for our listserv to hear about future webinars hosted by our project, FPN. And I'm now going to turn it over to Erin.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Okay. Hi, thank you, Ann. So my name is Erin Biehl. As she said, I work in the Food System Sustainability and Public Health program here at CLF, and I work specifically on urban food system resilience with the Baltimore City Office of Sustainability. So today I'm just going to give a quick overview of what resilience is and why we should be thinking about it when we think about supporting food systems. And then I'll give a quick overview of what we've been doing with Baltimore City. Okay, so it's a little challenging to see here, but we live in challenging times and climate change is upon us. And it's expected that as the planet warms, we will see some considerable changes to our food system, all the way from production, agricultural production, through to what foods we can consume and how we can access them. As you see in the graph here, climate change is expected to impact ecosystems, water availability, crop yields, and we are also expecting to see more extreme weather events. And these weather events can impact food production, but also they could disrupt supply chains and the movement of food from farms to cities. And they can also make it a lot harder for people to access food if roads are blocked or if buildings are destroyed. So there's a lot of things related to climate change that we need to be thinking about when we think about future food security. Okay. Okay. But climate change isn't the only thing that worries me when I do this work. There is a whole host of other threats that have the potential to disrupt a food system and increase food insecurity in a community or worldwide. For example, as the population grows, we know it's going to be harder and harder to produce enough food to feed the population unless we distribute it more efficiently and increase production in some places. We also know that, for example, an infectious disease that causes a pandemic or an epidemic in one area could knock out a labor force. And if the labor force is knocked out, that could have some implications on the food system in terms of, having people to grow food, take it places, and sell it. And then finally, there are a host of economic threats to food systems as well. And also the idea that as incomes rise globally, we're seeing shifts in what people are eating. And in particular, we see more and more animal food consumption, which actually can contribute higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions and contribute more to climate change. So there's a lot of short-term and long-term hazards and threats that we think about when we think about protecting the food system in the future. So what do we do about this? Well, there's kind of two main avenues for action as I think about it. That's through mitigation and adaptation. Particularly with climate change, mitigation is just reducing the man-made causes of climate change. So one example could be through changing procurement practices at an institution that focuses on serving more foods that are less greenhouse gas intensive, for example. And I think Becca might be talking a little bit about that later. And then on the adaptation side, adaptation is really minimizing the vulnerability of the food system to the effects of climate change. So kind of recognizing that some bad things are probably going to happen in the future. So how can we make sure that like a minimum number of people, infrastructure, buildings related to the food system are affected by climate change? So hopefully the solution to that, or one of them, is to have more resilient food systems. And resilience is the ability to absorb, respond to, recover from, and adapt more successfully to these adverse events. And I actually stole this figure from Kim. It's essentially illustrating food system resilience. So on the y-axis, you have food access and availability, and the x-axis is over time. So essentially, at one point in time, food access and availability is at a certain level. And if you have a shock to the system that decreases access, a more resilient system is going to take less time to recover from that shock. And it's also going to be less impacted by that shock to begin with. And so improving resilience involves figuring out how to make that area between the curve and the dotted line as small as possible. So what makes a food system resilient? I think you'll hear some more examples from Kim next. But right now, there are more and more people in academia in particular who are trying to identify what indicators of food system resilience are. But in general, you'll see a lot of information focusing on having lower risk, exposure, and vulnerability to these threats that I've talked about, and then having more flexibility, diversity, redundancy, and adaptability. So yes, go ahead. All right, so I also want to just present a few ways that people at different levels are addressing resilience, and specifically with food systems. At the local level, there's been more and more city planning, especially in urban areas, including resilience in food plans and including food in climate adaptation plans for cities. And that's something that we've started doing in Baltimore. In the US at the national level, specifically with climate, President Obama had some executive orders and a climate action plan that really supported the federal government and agencies developing ways to address climate adaptation. And some of that relates to the food system. Unfortunately, President Trump now is kind of rescinded some of those Obama era actions. So we will see what kind of effect that has on federal support in the US for climate adaptation and resilience planning. And then finally, at the international level, the Milan Food Policy Pact in October of 2015, I think 140 cities got together and came up with a pact on what to make ideal urban food systems of the future, essentially. And they included resilience as a key goal for urban food systems in the future. So it's something that's being discussed at many different levels. How are we on time? All right. Okay. So in the last couple of minutes, I think real quick, I'll just talk about Baltimore. Okay. So if you're not familiar with Baltimore, we're a city located on the east coast of the US, and about a quarter of our residents of the city live in a food desert, which is an area that there's very low food access and very low availability of healthy foods. And 23% of residents are food insecure. And in Baltimore in 2015, we had some civil unrest. And as you can see in the map here, the red areas are areas that are classified as food deserts, so there's very low food access and low healthy food availability. And then the blue dots are all of the food selling stores in the city that were damaged or lost inventory because of the civil unrest that was in the city.
Just mention the name, Pretty Gray.
Oh yeah, okay. I'll mention the civil unrest. So it was unrest that occurred as a result of the death of Freddie Gray and actions that happened with the police afterwards. So it was kind of spread in many areas of the city, but we saw that it actually had some impact on the food system, and at least in the short term on residents' availability and access to food. So that event kind of gave some impetus for the city to start thinking about how to recover to these short-term events in the city, and then how to develop planning around resilience of the food system in the long term. So we partnered with the city and developed a food system resilience assessment for Baltimore City, which is now turned over to the city and is going to be developed into formal policy with community input soon. We developed the assessment basically through interviewing food system stakeholders in the city, doing literature reviews, and doing some GIS mapping of vulnerable communities in relation to hazards that we thought would be most impactful on Baltimore's food system. Oops. And so we actually came up with, I think, 36 different specific recommendations for how Baltimore City could improve the resilience of its food system, but we also came away with a few more broader strategies that we think could be useful for other cities. And so the first one was just to address existing vulnerabilities in physical and economic food access now, because as we know, like in Baltimore, if there are a lot of people who already can't access food easily, what happens when the only food source in their community gets shut down for a number of days, or they can't drive to a store that's very far away? So improving food security now can be very important for resilience further on. Second, we wanted to just point out that it's important to support local food economies, but for redundancy in a food system, you don't want all of your food coming from a local area, because if you have a storm that knocks out the region for a week or 2 weeks, you also lose your food supply. So it's important to have that redundancy and diversity in food sources. Also, through the interviews, we learned from a lot of smaller businesses and nonprofits that they aren't necessarily that prepared yet for a lot of these threats. And so there could be more support for them. And in community interviews, we heard a lot of stories about neighbors helping each other out after a winter storm and getting food for each other. And so it's important to have resilience at the local community level and not just think about supply chains or farms. Like I said earlier, it was important to incorporate food into resilience planning and vice versa, and then to involve stakeholders from all levels. In Baltimore, they developed an emergency food working group to develop a very short-term food access plan after emergencies. And we had a huge winter storm hit during the whole planning process. And because they had already developed relationships between nonprofits and the city, they were able to improve communication and improve food deliveries to the most hard-hit communities during that snowstorm. So those are just some lessons learned and a general overview, and I will pass it on to the next speaker.
Kim, you're welcome to start sharing your screen.
Great. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. Great.
And if you could put it in presenter mode.
Mm-hmm. I'm not seeing.
If you go to just your regular slideshow presenter mode in PowerPoint.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today on the webinar. I'm Kim Zilli. I'm Senior Vice President and Director of Research and Advisory Practice at ICIC, which is the Initiative for Competitive Inner City. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've evolved some of our food work, which traditionally looked at food and the local economies, especially in distressed inner city neighborhoods, and began to look more at the resilience perspective on food systems. ICIC, we're a nonprofit. We're headquartered in Boston, and we were started in 1994 by Harvard Business School professor Michael Porter. So the framework that we developed, which helped inform Erin's nice review of Baltimore, and it's been used in Boston and New York studies, and we've continued to refine this approach, where we've also partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation, and we've conducted assessments of the resilience of food systems in New Orleans, Los Angeles, and Madison, Wisconsin as well. So our focus is on the urban component, so not the production side of agriculture, which obviously will be affected by disasters and climate change, but we're really focused on how resilient are cities, the food systems within cities, to natural disasters. So we're focused on food processing, distribution, and retail and food insecurity, which together make up food access. So in this framework, as you can see here, we have identified specific vulnerabilities that we can assess in any urban market. And the at-risk areas are defined as the impact area of the natural disaster risk being analyzed. So then we also look at government policies and practices as well, and how those influence all of these different components of the food system. So the characteristics of a resilient urban food system. Within food distribution, it's having some of that redundancy that Erin spoke about, having warehouses located outside of the city or outside of the at-risk area. So if it's Los Angeles and you're concerned about the impact of an earthquake, right, you want to look at the earthquake shake zone, where it's going to impact it, and make sure some of the distribution sites are outside of that zone. That's the same, if you're looking at a tornado, or if you're looking at flooding, you have to look at where the natural disaster is most likely to hit. So this is different, and retail, right, is the same idea of where these companies are located. And right now they're being located in areas that make the most economic sense and not based on resilience. We're also concerned about having redundant transportation networks. So a lot of cities rely on some major thoroughfares, some major highways, bridges, they might have tunnels. So making sure that you have multiple inways into the city that trucks transporting food can access. And then in terms of food retail, making sure there's looking at the neighborhoods. As we know, working on inner cities, neighborhoods within a city vary in terms of their access to all sorts of amenities, but especially in terms of their access to food. And so our framework allows us to look at which cities are most likely to, A, be impacted by the event, the natural disaster, and what type of retail stores do they have there? Are they mostly mom and pop shops, bodegas, or do they have large national, international food retail chains? If it's the large national, international food stores, there's going to be a lot more resources available for those type of stores to weather the storm and then be able to get back online quickly. If it's an independent business owner, a small bodega, mom and pop shop, right, much more difficult for those stores, A, to be prepared, and then to be able to rebuild. Because although they may have insurance, they don't always have adequate insurance, and they don't always have the capital to put up front while they wait for the reinvestment. Food insecurity is a growing issue within the US. Most of the food banks have exceeded their capacity already, which means that they already cannot fully supply all of the demand they need through the food safety network, so food banks, food pantries, etc. We know that when a natural disaster hits, the demand for accessing more food from food banks and food pantries from the food safety network, we know that after a natural disaster that spikes, and it doesn't just spike temporarily. In the case of New York City after Sandy, some food banks and food pantries actually had increased demand for a much longer period of time, for about a year.
Hey, Kim, this is Ann.
And finally, yeah.
Your voice is moving. For some reason, I know you're not moving, but the speaker, the quality of your, the volume is like it's up and down. I'm just wondering if you can get closer to your mic.
I will try.
Okay, thank you.
All right, sorry about that. And in terms of government policies and practices, in terms of what they can focus on, making sure there's this strong public-private sector coordination and planning, making sure that the regulations around who can access the city and the roads as first responders to make sure that the food retail stores and the supply of food happens quickly, that the policies and the regulations around getting businesses back online, because a lot of the food businesses have to be inspected, so making sure there are sufficient inspectors. And all of that is planned out ahead of time, that there are specific plans, people know who to call, when to call, and that's all streamlined to make sure the food stores, the distribution, the retail stores get up and running quickly. So just to give you an example of some of the threats to urban food systems, this is in New York City, and there's a map there that shows where all the supermarkets, grocery stores, corner stores, etc. are. And the biggest threat to New York City we found is Hunts Point, which is where most of the fresh food travels through. About 50% of food more than 50% of fresh food travels through Hunts Point. And in terms of transportation, is another big risk for New York City. It's the island. So 50% of food travels through only 4 bridges and 2 tunnels. And in Superstorm Sandy, some of those were impacted. In a larger storm, it's likely that they would all be impacted in some way and perhaps closed. In terms of food access, less than 2% of the neighborhoods have vulnerable food retail, and those are concentrated in Brooklyn and Queens. And this is because of the unique situation of New York City's food system, which has lots of corner stores spread across the city. So there are very few true food deserts in New York, but in some of the areas where they had a relatively small share of the grocery stores and smaller share of the corner stores in general, seem to be concentrated in these neighborhoods that were then also hit hard by superstorm and would be hit hard by a hurricane as well. So New York City is one of the leading cities out there looking at their food system resilience, and they completed a very thorough supply study of their food systems. If you haven't seen that, it's called the 5-borough food flow, and available online, and that was just completed last year. And so they're using that to help inform their future interventions in terms of creating a more resilient food system. And again, their motivation for New York came out of Superstorm Sandy, where they realized their food system had been impacted. They realized there was this near miss around Hunts Point. You can see it's surrounded by water. And so they won some competitions, Rebuild by Design. So they're really focused on the resilience around the Hunts Point area and better understanding their food system and making sure that it's integrated into their overall resilience plan. So really leading edge. Another example of a resilient food system is in Madison, Wisconsin. Part of the reason this is resilient, and we want to juxtapose this against a coastal city. It's in the Midwest, so it's not going to be threatened by hurricanes or superstorms, more likely to be impacted by an ice event or a tornado. But in Madison, they've really had plans in place for several years in terms of making sure that they have a very resilient food system. 18 out of 20 of their suppliers located outside of the city. They have redundant transportation. Their food insecurity is pretty low. And they have some vulnerable food retail neighborhoods, but they already have plans in place for addressing those neighborhoods. So what we created based on our assessments and studies of all of these different cities is what we call a playbook for building a resilient food system. And step 1 is conducting that food system resilient assessment. So you heard sort of high level from us and from Erin in terms of what some vulnerabilities are in Baltimore, but they vary by city. Every city has a relatively unique food system, and they need to understand what the specific risks are for each city, and then incorporating that into the resilience planning and the urban food agendas, developing the neighborhood food resilience plans, making sure there's short and long-term resilience planning, strengthening the food business resilience for both the large corporations as well as the smaller businesses, and then establishing the policies to help food businesses return to normal. And that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. So next up we have Becca. Becca, you're welcome to start sharing your screen and unmuting yourself.
I am working on the screen sharing right now.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yep. Sounds good.
Let's not put that on the screen. Okay. Hello, good morning, and thank you, or afternoon, I should say. Thank you for the opportunity, Food Policy Network's project, to present on this and be part of such a great lineup of experts. I am here on behalf of Friends of the Earth, which is a national nonprofit based in both Berkeley, California and DC. and connected to a global network in 73 countries of other Friends of the Earth. I'm going to take us on a slightly different track, which is looking at, as Erin alluded to, how food procurement can get towards some of these mitigation goals that were mentioned. And so today I'm just going to talk about a couple things. Friends of the Earth is creating a guide for municipalities around food procurement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're creating this guide, as well as the approach and framing in the guide, and then share a few examples from the guide. So the first, you sort of already heard this, the reason that we feel this urgency around the guide, and I should say the guide focuses around a triple bottom line of health, cost savings, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and water use to get at creating a more resilient food system. So this is part of what you're seeing is a graph that was compiled by the Center for a Livable Future of research looking at what does it mean if meat intake continues as it's currently continuing? Will we be able to address our goals around climate change? And as some research shows, if we continue on the current track, that's this red bar here, which is as incomes increase, so does meat consumption. And we would be already hitting, using our entire budget, this dotted line here is sort of the breaking point of emissions for whether or not we hit catastrophic climate change or not. And so researchers have looked at ways of sort of, bringing that bar back and allowing us to have a better chance of meeting those goals. And as you can see here, a lower meat diet, sorry, my mouse is changing our screen here. A lower meat diet will give us more space, more opportunity, because we need to include all the other emissions in these bars here as well. So that's sort of the urgency that we're feeling behind this. And the reason that we focus on less meat and dairy as well as better produced meat and dairy is because of these emission profiles of different types of food. So you can see in this graph, lamb and beef have the highest emissions profiles, and things like broccoli, dry beans, lentils have much, much lower emissions. There's also a huge amount of water used to create beef and dairy products, as well as nuts and other things, and you can sort of get a sense of our food choices really do impact the resources that are used to create the foods that we eat. And so, but within the guide, so we take this approach of looking at this triple bottom line. As some have alluded to in the past, this current administration maybe isn't as interested in talking about climate change, but it's not just a climate benefit that comes from changing what we're procuring within our cities and counties and institutions, but also it impacts our health and it impacts economies. So this graph put together by Changing Tastes and the Culinary Institute of America shows you not only on the right side the greenhouse gas emissions coming from these different types of foods, but on the left side it's the percent reduced risk of premature death as compared to eating red meat if you eat these other things. So as you can see, the risk of the ability to reduce your risk goes up, the less meat is consumed. And so part of the inspiration for creating this guide was that we know these changes need to happen, and we also know that it's important to be able to document and show what the impacts of such changes. So a recent report that my colleagues at Friends of the Earth put together was around shifts in less and better meat made by the Oakland Unified School District. And you can see a picture of the report cover there, as well as one of the graphs from the report, which shows that they saved 42 million gallons of water. They reduced their carbon footprint by 14%, and that they saved $42,000 over this 3-year period with just a 1% shift in the amount of meat being served. So this guide that we're creating is going to have a whole range of tools and examples in it. It has executive orders and legal policies, contracts, RFPs, climate action plans, ways of getting at creative menus, guidelines, things that can be done around leases and city-owned, county-owned property, as well as proclamations and pacts like the Milan Pact that Erin mentioned, and then sort of tools and tips from those who have already been engaged in this. And so given our limited time, I just wanted to share a few examples with you all of what's in the guide. So one of the things we look at is the city of San Francisco, which in 2009, I believe, put together, the mayor made an executive directive, and this is just a few highlights from the executive directive that shows the commitment that the city had to creating a more sustainable food system and the reasons for doing so. So it talks about long-term economic prosperity. It talks about the ability of future generations to be food self-sufficient. So we're not just, talking about something because, oh, maybe this would be a nice thing to do. Like this, shifting our food system is necessary in order for future generations to survive and thrive. It also talks about the importance, as you can see there at the bottom, about educating not only food system stakeholders, but the population in general about these issues. And it says that city resources are going to be committed to purchasing and promoting regionally produced and sustainably certified food. And the city has since done a range of actions that come from this executive directive. So having that leadership say, this is really important, then agencies under that leadership are able to then take advantage of that pathway and make changes within the system. San Diego did some similar things. They set out to do more of a legal directive type of document, but in the end it's turned out to be suggested practices, but that doesn't mean that there's not the same energy and enthusiasm behind this, and that those in charge of this are really working hard to provide tools and ways for the agencies in the county and city to enact this. So you'll see some of the tips they offer is like prioritize plant-based foods, including protein and dairy alternatives, offer plant-based foods and dishes and vegetarian meals. The goals as are laid out here, and I don't usually create such text-heavy slides, but I knew that these would be shared with you later, and I thought that having more language rather than less might be a useful tool and inspiration for you, and sort of a teaser of the kinds of things that you'll be able to access when the guide is available later this summer. So you can see that they want to build better health by offering healthier options, and often a healthier option does mean more fruits and vegetables, which can mean less meat and dairy. They want to support a thriving economy, and they want to foster this resilient environment. Another example of fostering resilient environment is climate action plans, which really set out cities and counties, put them together in order to say, we want to address climate change and here's how we're going to do it. And these are examples of climate action plans that include reduced meat consumption as part of their goals. Portland, Oregon was one of those cities, and some of you may be sitting here who work with cities thinking, well, we don't really order that much food, and it's more the county, the school district, the hospitals, prisons and jails. But cities can take really strong leadership, not only in guidelines for their own meetings, but around events, around leases that if it's city-owned property, you can put something in the contract language about the type of food that can and should be served, and do so in a way that continues to outline and align with the goals of the city as versus maybe seeming rather paternalistic, which is one of the pushbacks that happens against this kind of conversation. Los Angeles, I highlight here, again, heavy text because this is a useful and I think really important piece of information, is to make sure that when you do write RFPs and contracts with food service providers, that you include language requiring that they report to you information about what it is that is being purchased and served, because in order for us to be able to continue to tell these stories, we need the data. And so this graphic here comes from the Oakland Unified School District report done by Friends of the Earth, but we wouldn't be able to show a picture like this if we hadn't had the data of what the school district is purchasing. So this is sort of the baseline of where they started, and you can see the carbon footprint of the food, and then we were able to show the change that they made. And so it's really important. It's often not the city or the county that has access to the data, but instead the food service provider that one is contracting with. And so just an extra push to say that metrics are really important. We're getting close to the end of time here, and I look forward to the discussion. One of the things I wanted to leave you with, especially as we're heading toward Memorial Day weekend, is an effort that Friends of the Earth is working on called the Better Burger Challenge. And it's about reducing the amount of meat in a burger and replacing 30% of it with mushrooms, which increases the health profile, often the flavor profile, palatability of the burger, and then reduces by 30% the amount of meat that's being used. Now we say better burger, there are also blended burger initiatives that are happening, but the better is because the reduced cost that comes from adding the vegetable product, we then hope that people will use a better meat, so a meat that's produced in a way that's better for the environment, that creates soils that are more resilient. I didn't get into it here, but there's a lot of information. Center for a Livable Future has been a leader on this as well, that shows that how we produce meat is a big factor in whether or not that production practice is resilient. So monocultures versus pastures that can build the carbon in the soil, build the diversity of microorganisms living in the soil, as versus that kind of diversity that can be destroyed by pesticides and over application of fertilizer, etc. So that's not the purpose of this presentation, but I just wanted to highlight it and sort of inspire you to, whether you're doing a veggie burger and you do sustainably produced veggie burger, or whether you can reduce the amount of meat in a burger if you're doing some Memorial Day grilling this weekend. And so that's it for my presentation. I wanted to highlight my colleague Kari's information here because I am a consultant to Friends of the Earth. She's the full-time staff person there, so you have that here in the presentation. And the last piece is we really look forward to your feedback on the guide when it comes out. If you know of great examples that should be highlighted and you have not been in touch with us yet, we'd love to hear from you. We have a little bit of time before it's finalized, and then otherwise, once it's out, we look forward to hearing how it's useful for you and how we might update it to make it even more useful. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Becca. Natalie, you're next, and we will, Becca, if you could stop sharing your screen, and
yes,
we'll share ours.
I just need the option of stopping to share. I promise I'm not purposely making you look at my cute kid. Let's see, where, come here, menu. If I hit escape, is it gonna let me do it? Stop share, there it is. Sorry guys, thank you.
No problem. Okay. All right, Natalie, we're ready. Just let us know when you want us to advance the slides and we will do that.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on this call with everyone this afternoon. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm recovering from a little bit of whatever is going around, so my voice is a little raspy. I am Natalie Jairo. I'm the president and CEO of Second Harvest Food Bank of Greater New Orleans and Acadiana. So that we serve the entire southern part of the state of Louisiana. I got here in the fall of 2005, right after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and have been working here ever since in the last dozen years, where we've had quite a significant experience of disasters of every kind. or several kinds, not every kind, of course. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So disaster response has always been a core part of the mission of Second Harvest. And I would say, as the previous speakers did, food banks are part of the food resilience, food systems in general. I will tell you that after Katrina, one of the silver linings in that disaster was that food banks were actually at the table in a more holistic way with others that were discussing the food system. When you get such a level of devastation, it's important for everyone to work together because you have limited resources. So we worked with universities, with the retailers. We developed a much stronger partnership with government. We worked with community food security experts, and we've worked with some of the people that are presenting on this call ever since to try to make sure that that food system is more resilient at all times. For us, we're over 30 years old. We were founded in the aftermath of Hurricane Betsy because, like Katrina, Rita, and Sandy, so many of the other events that have struck our country lately, one of the things that happens is that exposes chronic disaster of hunger and poverty all over the country and the world. So in our case, Archbishop Hannon brought together community leaders to address the issue of hunger in South Louisiana. Next slide. This is how we do our work. This is our service area, the darker green. All of those dots are different kinds of organizations or partners that we work with. We know that there are 370,000 people that face food insecurity every day just here in South Louisiana. We're reaching about 210,000, so we have an urgency. We do not think the food system is resilient enough every day, and we feel the urgency to get more food into the hands of people that can use it. And of course, everyone knows that we waste 40% of everything we prepare, process, grow, manufacture in this country. We've heard a little bit about that in previous presentations. So food banks developed as a way to take this incredible resource and try to have a positive impact with it. Over the 30 years, how we do that has changed. And these dots represent all kinds of different partners. So we are working with those church pantries, but also with hospitals, healthcare providers, directly with schools, community organizations, senior centers, all these entities spread throughout every neighborhood and every community. That is the partner that's always there taking care of that local community year-round. Next slide. So, back one. I'm sorry, just need to add one thing to this. Also, when we talk about resilience and disaster, obviously my comments are more practical because our experience over the last dozen years has been doing this in the field. And part of what we take into account whenever we respond to a disaster is what our mission and our capacity is to respond. So in the case of Second Harvest, we have a 200,000 square foot warehouse. That's that little box you can see under Lake Pontchartrain on this map. We also have 30,000 additional square feet of warehouse over in Lafayette. We have 40,000 square feet of freezers and coolers. We have more than 20 refrigerated vehicles, 90 staff, a network of these 500 partner organizations, and thousands of volunteers. We're also fully generator powered, so we're able to start to respond as soon as a disaster occurs and the conditions become safe enough for us to operate our vehicles again. Okay, now next slide. I think the thing I would emphasize a lot about the way we look at disaster response and resilience is that flexibility has to be in everything we do. Over the last 12 years, we've gone through a variety of different kinds of incidents and disasters. And I would say for food banks, the economic recession was always also a disaster. So for us, it's scale, it's the nature of what's going on no two incidents look alike, no two situations look alike. We always have to be very approachable to change our strategy on the spot in order to respond to what's actually going on. That flexibility and responsiveness is a key part of the plan, and it's why we're trusted here in South Louisiana. So we try not to say no to anyone who calls us to ask for help, or anyone who calls us to ask us to help deliver resources to other people. And that's a very specific strategy that is kind of hard to implement. It means our staff is constantly rethinking what they're doing. But it is the core, having that support across government, public and private sectors, is how we're able to be this funnel for the incredible generosity of our community, country, and the world towards any community that's being severely affected by a disaster. Next slide. Obviously, Katrina and Rita was a testing ground. It was for the entire food bank network. We've been responding to disasters, and I mean Feeding America food banks, since Hurricane Andrew. But obviously, Katrina and Rita rewrote the story in terms of the level of devastation, and Sandy has been another chapter that has really woken us up, those of us that work in food insecurity, to understand that we play a pivotal role in this kind of situation, and that we have to be able to respond. In that instance, we weren't in our food bank. We were forced out because New Orleans had no power at that time. We had no generators. The gas lines had been cut to the city, so we operated out of an empty Walmart, and we're still able to distribute more than 8 million pounds monthly. And we did that because we accepted the help of people from around the country and the world. So we had food pouring in, we had some dollars coming in, we had volunteers coming in from everywhere. So we were constantly resetting to figure out how we funnel that into community needs. Next. Next slide, please. So obviously, our experience with disasters have continued in the dozen years. Gustav and Ike, the oil spill, for example, Hurricane Isaac recently, the flooding that you saw in Louisiana last year, the tornadoes that hit New Orleans East. Again, every single incident, when you are in the act of responding and for long-term recovery, they have different logistical challenges. Sometimes our communication systems were up, and sometimes they were down. Sometimes we couldn't get into certain communities because of road flooding. Sometimes we had power outages that lasted many weeks. Sometimes we had people out of jobs, as in the oil spill or the downturn in the oil and gas industry that's going on right now for a long period of time. Sometimes we have long-term closures of grocery stores. Previous speakers talked about the supply chains. It's once that's interrupted, it's not always easy to get the grocery stores back up and running. And so our goal personally at Second Harvest is to be ready to go to work alongside the National Guard as soon as conditions are safe to operate. Next slide. In the last year, we've experienced and responded to 4 major natural disasters, the 2 flooding events that we talked about, and a couple of tornado outbreaks. The next 3 slides are pictures, really, of our most recent disaster response. I'll just take this moment to talk a little bit about the importance of communications. Instant communications for us, social media, as well as press releases, talking to media stories, making phone calls, interacting with government at all levels, our federal delegation, our state emergency managers, hugely important. Being able to show these pictures on Facebook every day, tweet them out, talk about the efforts, show what's actually happening in communities, videotape stories of people that were affected, is what allowed us to break down the barriers, and frankly, support poured in as a result of it. So very, very important to, as part of your disaster plan, to make sure your communications ability is so strong so that you can bring together those resources. Next slide. So, and as a result of that, and largely because of social media, we were able to distribute 1 more than 1.5 million pounds of food, water, and disaster supplies in this 12-month period, and that's in addition to the 30 million pounds that we were distributing. So often we were responding to a disaster in a particular part of our service area, or we were responding to the everyday disaster of hunger throughout the rest of our 23 parishes. So we did both, which is takes a lot of planning on part of our staff. Next slide, you can actually skip 2 ahead. How do we do it? We have a standing, back one. We have a standing comprehensive disaster plan. And when I say a plan, we plan to plan. It's so important. Our plan is a framework that brings our team together to determine how we can meet the specific challenges of that incident. So it always includes the elements below, determining what that specific need is. That's gathering information from all our sources, individuals, government, our 500 partners spread across neighborhoods, other food banks in the region, anywhere where we can find out how people are being affected by a particular incident. Determine what our particular mission is and capacity to respond in this incident. Communicate our efforts as broadly as possible. That brings awareness so people who need help can get it. They know where to go. And it helps us raise the funds, donations, volunteers, and other supports that we need to respond. And also very deliberate communication that we initiate with our ongoing supporters and donors to ask for gifts and for resources that we need to respond. Next slide. This is just the first page of our plan. By the way, we review that plan every year with our entire team. Every staff member here at Second Harvest knows that being a first responder is part of their job description if they're called on. But we also take a lot of effort to ensure that we're protecting our staff and their ability to respond. That was another learned lesson after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, because often the responders are victims themselves of what's going on in their community. So your plan has to incorporate how you deal with that. Next slide. So we have our disaster plan. We're constantly looking at our partnerships. People change throughout emergency managers, legislators, delegations, volunteers, organizations that want to help. And thinking outside the box about partnerships and resilience. So for instance, pandemic was mentioned in one of the presentations. Second Harvest has a contract, as do all the food banks here in Louisiana, with our Department of Public Health to provide non-medical model vaccines if there is a pandemic. Why? It's because our partnerships is how the state and government realizes it has to access vulnerable people if a pandemic occurs and the kind of disruptions that were described earlier actually happen. Next slide. We provide support to our 550 community partner organizations. I just want to mention, as we talk about resilience, these organizations are here before a disaster, during, and in the long-term recovery. And a lot of our discussion is with FEMA after most major occurrences, natural disasters, because the Stafford Act, which is what governs the government response to natural disasters, is not very flexible in terms of what that long-term recovery for communities needs to look like. So this is a constant messaging and communication that we need to have, because for the organizations that may move in over the brief period that the disaster strikes in the immediate aftermath, there is so much work that has to be done on an ongoing basis, not only in recovery, but in making the food system resilient year-round. How am I doing on time? I must be getting close to the end. Next slide.
Yeah, you have about 1 or 2 minutes if you have.
Okay, so I'm about done. Next slide. So the disaster plan, the year-round partnerships, and with all kinds of national responders is critical to how we respond. It's ongoing communication. It's all the time, year-round. Next slide. Here are just a few of our partnerships, but we talked about some of the others. The Office of Public Health, for instance, here, Louisiana Department of Agriculture and Forestry, our 550 partners. All of those nonprofits that move into any community when there is a major natural disaster. Next slide. This one I think is a repeat. Oh, and we also plan by having thousands of pounds of emergency supplies ready to ship at a moment's notice. So if you come here to, again, this has to do with our capacity, to our warehouse here in New Orleans or in Lafayette, you're always going to see a supply of water, which is an incredibly important and always an immediate need after any kind of natural disaster. Foods that are ready to eat when people have no power, no ability to prepare food for themselves. Snack foods and very nutrition-dense foods like Pedialyte and Pediasure, so that we can make sure we're responding to those emergency needs. And we have them here in our warehouse year-round. We also get the MREs that FEMA stores that as they approach expiration date, which get distributed through our partner network. Next slide. I think, and the slide after that. So this concludes my comments. I really appreciate being part of this expert panel and would be happy to share any or answer any questions anyone has.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. And next we have Wendy. Wendy, do you want to go ahead and share your slides?
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Unlike what you see on your screen there, I'm not Kim. You've heard from Kim. This is in fact Wendy, so good afternoon. And we're rolling into lunchtime here in the West, so thank you all for sticking with it for a little bit longer with us. I'm also sitting on a ball, so hopefully I don't do this too much and make you ill while we're watching. I'll try to be still. So my job today really is to talk a little bit about a specific example of how a state council, the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council, has really raised awareness around a lot of these issues that we've been talking about today. And I'll explain in just a minute sort of what the role the Food Systems Advisory Council plays here in Colorado. Very quickly, because I actually work at Livable, Colorado, I wanted to let you know who we are. I am the Director of Food Systems at Livable, that was mentioned. I actually sit right now on the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council in a nutrition and health and wellness seat. Here at Livable, our mission is to increase access to healthy eating and active living by removing barriers that inequitably and disproportionately affect low-income communities and people of color. Specifically around food systems, we have a goal to build a sustainable, equitable, and health-promoting food environment. And we greatly value our ability to sit on entities like the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council that enhance our relationships with not only other nonprofits, organizations, but our state agencies. So the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council has its own charge, of course, and that is to advance recommendations that strengthen healthy food access for all Coloradans through Colorado agriculture and local food systems and economies. And there are some websites that we'll provide at the end of this if you want to go directly to our website and see anything that I've mentioned here. I also should mention that I was asked to present on the work of COSAC on this webinar because at the time of the work I'm going to talk about, I was actually staffing the council. And there are a lot of other council members that could talk about this work. Our chair, for example, Dawn Philmany from CSU, she actually is presenting right now on a competing webinar on how to measure the local impacts of local and regional food systems. So I'm the one presenting today, although I certainly, others could certainly do it. So just really quickly, COSAC. The bill was actually initiated by Livable, Colorado back in 2010. It is a governor-appointed council, was created through our state legislature, and it did go through a sunset renewal process a couple of years ago. The state structure, just a quick background, is very similar to other local food policy councils as well as state councils. It is a 15-member advisory body. It meets quarterly, that's the mandate. It provides recommendations to the General Assembly and the Governor's Office and appropriate regulatory agencies. It does not make policy. It is strictly sort of like an advisory body. And they issue annual reports. And the thing I'm going to show you is that in recent years, the council has shifted more to what they call issue briefs, which are a little bit deeper dive documents into very specific topical areas. In addition to the three I'm going to show you today, We kicked off sort of the issue brief series by looking at issues of SNAP, so formerly food stamps at farmers markets, and then the need for more technical assistance for direct market farming operations in Colorado. So also very typical membership across multiple state agencies, multiple other just sort of topical seats sit on the council, wholesale, retail, actual producers, nutrition and health, economic development, etc. So pretty typical structure for a state council. So the issues that I want to talk about today, obviously relevant to this webinar, are 3 issue briefs that the council developed in 2014 and 2015. And as you can see, the 3 focused on water, energy, and land. And I should say that this focus sort of came to attention of COSAC, obviously because of all of the issues that all of the speakers before me have already articulated and laid out, of the importance of the connection between these natural resources and our food system. But really initially is that we created a process where anyone could submit issues on the website and say, hey, here's an issue that I think needs state attention, or would for some reason bring in multiple state agencies. We'd like to raise it, elevate this issue for COSAC. And we did have an organization raise an issue, submit an issue specific to water, which I will talk about in a minute. But once that issue came through, it kind of led to this broader conversation within COSAC of maybe this is an opportunity to really look at the role of other sort of natural resources and our food system. So it led to this conversation of let's do this sort of trio of issue briefs, really looking at water, energy, land, nexus with food systems. So this is an example of what the issue briefs look like. This is just a screenshot of the first page. They all look this way. They all are structured the same way. Each one sort of has the same, outline where we go into the issue. Like, what is the issue we're talking about? What do we know about sort of the state of water and agriculture today, for example? Then we go in and highlight opportunities, right? What are some opportunities where Colorado could really lead the way here? In each one, we provide examples from the field, better known as maybe case studies or little stories, and then everyone ends with recommendations. And the recommendations across are also pretty consistent, is that we always wanted to identify additional research and assessment needs, fundraising needs, or generally opportunities for leveraging additional resources, any regulatory amendments that we could call attention to, and other state partnerships. So what are actual roles for state agencies and other state partners? So here what I'm showing is then from part 1. So preparing what we call these issue briefs, the trio of issue briefs is preparing for food security in an age of limited natural resources. And part 1 was on water. So this is what I provided here in this slide is just a snippet, just an example of some of the recommendations that we landed on. Again, I will have the website on the slides. You can go look at the full issue briefs if you want to after this. These are 3 of what were probably more like 8 or so recommendations at the end. But again, as I mentioned, the water issue is one that came straight to the council, was raised by some of our organizational partners. Specifically, it was an issue raised by Denver Urban Gardens and Denver Water. And the whole focus of this one, as you can kind of get to see through the recommendations on the slide here, was examining this issue of the use of recycled water. So in the state of Colorado, it's called Regulation 84. And so Reg 84, which is a regulation that lives within the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and it is overseen, their advisory board is the Water Quality Control Commission of CDPHE, or Public Health and Environment Department. And so what the proposal was is, could we look at Reg 84, right? The treatment, what you can use recycled water for. States are making amendments to this all the time in terms of you can use recycled water for laundromats, golf courses, car washes, things like that. So the proposal was, we're not the first to do this. Could we amend Reg 84 to use recycled water treated through a municipal wastewater treatment facility for edible crop production, on edible crop production? So it's like a purple pipes is the way we refer to it. So it makes sense. This came to us from Denver Water, which is a recycled water treatment facility, and Denver Urban Gardens, whose gardens could really benefit from expanded access to affordable water if you could use recycled water. So that was the issue that came forward. We explored it heavily through this issue brief. Takeaway on this one is that certainly not, we were one of many voices. I think we raised awareness around this issue, There were a lot of other partners raising awareness around this issue. Some of our issue brief has been used in testimony to the Water Quality Control Commission. And the process continues. It's turning out to be like a 4-year process. That it was recommended that it went into a little bit more sort of outreach and engagement, since there are a lot of public maybe misconceptions and concerns and questions. So they're moving into this process of really stakeholder engagement, and there will be final rulemaking in August of 2018. So another example is preparing for food security in an age of limited natural resources, land use. So again, here are some examples of what we explored in land use. And the real sort of the impetus behind the land use one, there was already sort of one little issue that led us into a much bigger pool here. The impetus here was really looking at urban agriculture enterprise zones. And not surprisingly inspired by the work in the state of California, we wanted to, or many partners wanted to explore, and then brought this to the attention of COSAC. Is there potential to amend the state's ag enterprise zones to include a specific urban agriculture enterprise zone? And basically what this has led to is it's really grown much past the state council, but it sort of inspired many, many other partners to look more deeply in this work. What we figured out very quickly is we needed a much more in-depth policy analysis. We really needed to understand who else has tried what in terms of incentives and credits, and what has actually led to what sort of change or impact. So we have had actually a series of 2 students now that have been able to work with us and do some of those sort of policy white papers and provide some recommendations about where do we think in Colorado we're really best in a good position to explore sort of incentives, tax incentive structure to encourage urban agriculture primarily. So more to come on that. We have recommendations now. We need to figure out how to move forward. And the last one, part 3, is energy. And I apologize, I can't see the full screen. Can you see the full screen? That's very weird. Okay, I apologize about this screen. It looks normal when I minimize it. So this screen should really walk through, just as, again, some examples of recommendations around the connection, sort of the food, water, energy nexus. So just to summarize these, and again, you can look online. We did make some recommendations here that, again, not necessarily because of this issue brief, but we were able to bring state partners together, increase awareness of our state agencies, and get a lot of exposure to state experts in these areas. But a couple things that have happened since then is one of these recommendations here does talk about integrating greenhouse audits and renewable energy analysis into the Colorado Energy Office, and that actually has happened. So there's a couple of fun updates, again, not just because of this issue brief, but so now the Ag Energy Program does include greenhouse audits and renewable energy. There's been a couple of really cool things that have emerged. All of this typically funded by the USDA. We've had some interesting pilots where, for example, a farmer installed a small solar array to offset his energy use used from his pivot, his watering system. They also have some new funds to do what they call feedlot assessments for solar energy. Some more new work there, phase. And one thing I should say too, it's not listed here, but it is in the issue briefs. Is in the issue briefs we call out on every one of these where we see federal funding coming from. So which departments, how much money has been invested nationally in Colorado for all of these issues, energy, land, and water. So there's some good just sort of resources in the actual issue briefs. I should note in this area, in addition to having a very sort of chaotic and unclear federal funding environment right now, we actually don't know if our Colorado Energy Office is actually going to be renewed. It actually wasn't renewed in our legislative session, although there's some efforts in currents right now to sort of keep it going. Anyway, I just wanted to flag these 3 examples of, again, this council itself is not necessarily the body implementing this work, but it has provided an entity, a place to raise awareness, to educate themselves, educate state agencies and others about these issues, and then develop documents like these to elevate these issues to other partners around the state as well. And documents that then could be used in things like testimonies or in cool webinars like this. So these are the websites you can go to for more information. And thank you for your time.
Great, thanks, Kim.
Wendy.
Sorry, Wendy. I was reading Kim as I was looking at you. Great, and so we're going to pull this up. It's not sharing my screen. Just go ahead and open it
Okay,
up for
so
questions.
we've got about 15 minutes at the end here to do some Q&A with the panelists. So we've had a couple comments coming in during the presentation, so I'm just going to go through the questions that people have already asked, and then if you think of anything more while we're discussing, feel free to add a comment in the chat box. We're not muted, right? Okay. So we had a question from Liana. How does healthy food fit into this model? And I can answer that, I guess, first in terms of the Baltimore model. We did have a discussion with the city early on about when you think about disasters, should we be focusing on healthy food access at all times, or should we just be focusing on any food? And we decided that we really wanted to aim for a healthy food focus because that is the focus of a lot of what the city has done already. And all of the food desert methodology that we use includes healthy food availability. And we use food deserts as a reference and as a way of looking at vulnerable neighborhoods. So for us, the goal in resilience is not just to have any food available, but to have healthy food available at all times to really fit the definition of food security. So, and then I think, Becca, you also had wanted to comment a little bit more about the health.
Yeah, and so as you probably noticed from my presentation, we are sort of looking at resiliency of how do we step back and look at the long-term and big picture of this. And so shifting what it is that we're eating not only impacts how our land is being used and our resources, which then impacts whether or not climate change is the magnitude that it is or whether we have water available to us, but also by shifting our diets toward more plant-based foods and reducing the amount of meat and dairy in the diet, we are able to reduce the amount of diet-related diseases. And so if you have a population that is healthier to begin with, when a disaster does hit, there are hopefully fewer people in the hospital who need to be transported elsewhere. Their population is generally healthier, such that if food access did dip such that a diverse diet wasn't available for a certain amount of time, that they are already more resilient internally in their bodies. And so we think this healthier diet is important not only for the health of the planet, but the health of people.
Mm-hmm. Karen, could I add something to that?
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that for food banks, increasingly, we understand that food insecurity is really about health and nutrition. So I talked about the partnerships that we have with healthcare providers and hospitals. We do health fairs on a regular basis. So most of us now have strategies, and all of us would, if they could, have strategies to increase the amount of healthy food that we can make available to vulnerable people, and also to give them the tools to improve their diet. So I would say we're very aware of the healthy food. Of course, it makes a difference. Sick people are vulnerable people. They become more vulnerable in a disaster situation. But it's part of our ongoing work.
Mm-hmm. Kim or Wendy, did you have a comment on that? No? Okay. So we also had a question from Rodrigo. Can you explain the food vulnerability assessment a bit more? And I think this was directly relating to Baltimore. So I didn't really have time to go in depth on what we actually did and how we did the assessment, but that's a great question. We are actually in the process of formatting the report for release. So that's a resource that we can also share with people on this webinar and through the Food Policy Network resources. So you'll be able to read more about the report soon. But in terms of how we identified vulnerable communities, we looked at, basically we looked at who are the people who might be most affected by a list of different hazards. What are the parts of the infrastructure and the food supply chain that would be most vulnerable, and then what are the physical facilities and buildings in the city that might be geographically located in areas that are more vulnerable. So looking at flooding, for example, we mapped all of the different food stores, food service institutions, restaurants, all of the food facilities, and found how many of them are located in flood zones and what are those critical areas that might be more impacted by a flood. So that could be a focus area for future work. And we also, in the city's emergency food plan that I mentioned that they adopted through this whole process, they decided to focus specifically on children, children and seniors in particular, recognizing that those are populations that are more reliant on other people potentially to get their food sources. And if schools are closed, that can have a huge impact on students across the city if many of them rely on school food for most of their food. So we'll have more information coming out soon about more of the details on how we did that assessment.
Karen?
Yes.
I don't know if you want us to just keep adding small comments as these questions come up or not.
Yeah, add comments in the comment box, or if you wanted to add anything to that specifically.
I'll just quickly say that food insecurity is not the same as poverty, and it's a great question to try to evaluate that. About 30% of the people that food banks across the country serve are at greater than 185% of poverty. So just to get that out there, that often working people are struggling more and more, and any kind of disaster affects their work. The resources that they're bringing in to help their family get through, so they become increasingly vulnerable. But it's a great thing to actually evaluate who is food insecure, and we don't have enough research nationwide on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right. Oh, we had a question from Eileen. What types of funding sources are available for nonprofits to support food resilience? And I think, Natalie, you had actually provided some comments, but I don't know if everyone saw what you said. So could you share your answer to that? Funding sources?
I wanted to give everyone else the opportunity to talk. I just basically said that as you build relationships with government, if you're practically involved in this work, you will discover government resources that are available to help you. So, for instance, our generators here at Second Harvest Food Bank were paid for out of a hazard mitigation fund that is federal funding that's available to any government at the local county, or in our case, parish level. So there are government resources. Relationships are the best way to get to that. But for us, communicating with our ongoing partners, making that connection between the fact that hunger is always a disaster, most of our support comes from the local community in disaster response. They want to help. You have to give them the mechanism to do it. So your social media and your communications, your availability to accept the resources that are given to you in your local environment is going to be the strongest thing you can do. And that's while you're responding and as you're planning for future disasters.
Mm-hmm. Should we do the political one?
Yeah. So we had a question from the CLF side, or no, this was
someone wrote it in.
Someone wrote in a question through the Food Policy Network listserv, I believe. They said resilience is often seen as a partisan issue or not an issue at all in a state like Idaho. How do we frame a narrative that brings people in without alienating farmers and potential supporters that self-identify as politically conservative? So I'll open this up to anyone on the panel.
So I addressed it a little bit in my presentation, and I don't want to hog the mic here, so I'd love to hear from others on this. But I think one of the key things is to talk about economics in this regard, and there's a certain amount of self-sufficiency that can go along with resiliency. So we want the city to be sufficient, but we know that it can't be exclusively self-sufficient, as folks said in this conversation, in terms of food. And so we need to make plans that allow the city to thrive and be sufficient, and that requires then these partnerships and these relationships. Cost savings is another one that's, again, related to economics. And then the job growth side of things that comes from, on our side, from sourcing what we call better meat, or meat that's produced in a way that's better for the environment, ends up creating jobs rather than the more industrial kind of production that tends to take jobs away from communities.
And I would also answer that and just say that a lot of the solutions that you can come up with when you're thinking about resilience are kind of can be win-win solutions. And like Natalie's talked a lot about how chronic food insecurity can be seen as a disaster for many people. So if you're working to improve food insecurity in general, and if the efforts that you take to improve resilience, whether it's to climate or something else, that can also have benefits in the community in other ways. And I think there are many ways to frame this work without getting into like if climate is an issue, or that framing is an issue. I think there are many different ways to talk about it.
I get the raised hand.
Oh yeah. So Cicely Garrett had raised her hand during this. Do you let's see.
I don't know if she's still on.
Okay.
You can see. Okay. It looks like she's
she may
left.
not be there. Okay.
So.
There was a question about can you provide a definition of redundancy as it applies to food system resilience? And Kim, would you mind tackling that question? I think you had talked a little bit about it in your presentation.
And so the question was, what is redundancy?
Yeah, just give an example of it in the food system.
So for example, in transportation, making sure you have multiple routes into the city. So if one is shut down from the disaster, impacted by the disaster, you have alternate routes, and that's identified before any type of disaster. So you're not in the moment having to switch roadways. It's making sure you have multiple distribution sites for food coming into stores, multiple suppliers coming into stores, multiple retail outlets within, say, a 1 mile walkable area of most residents. So when one shuts down, something else can replace it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. There's a hospital.
Oh yeah.
And then we had a question somewhere about hospitals.
I don't see it.
Karen, is that the one that was in the chat box?
Yeah.
You answered? It was in the chat.
Oh, you answered it. Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Or was it in the?
Okay.
I thought, now it's disappeared. Okay.
Yeah, maybe it's answered.
I think when you answer it, it goes away.
Okay.
So.
Perhaps I should not have answered it then.
Oh, well, it must have helped. So Liana had another question. Can anyone speak to how resilience differs in urban versus rural areas?
So, Karen, can I talk a little bit about the differences we see since we serve both urban and rural areas?
Yeah, that would be great.
And I also, I want to kind of talk a little bit. I mentioned the Stafford Act, which is the government act that really guides federal resources towards disaster response when the disaster is at that level. And it's particularly pertinent to this question of rural versus urban, because the way the Stafford Act is written, and it covers things like disaster food stamps, congregate or shelter type of programs. It's supposed to be a blueprint for all types of disaster response, but it's a very, like most government programs, it's a blunt instrument, and it doesn't have the ability to flex. So let's say the floods right after the August storms, because the area around Baton Rouge had people were forced out of their homes and shelters were opened, the government was able to provide congregate food to the Red Crosses in the shelters that were opening up. But it meant they would not release disaster SNAP availability to people that might have been in those rural parishes that weren't in shelters, that may have been stuck in their homes and really needed another way to access resources. Mm-hmm. So I'll say an urban area, obviously more people are affected at once, so it's very, very high impact, but the resources are generally more available than they are in more rural areas, and figuring out how to get the kind of right resources to people that aren't sitting in a metropolitan area and may not have a grocery store nearby, may be cut off from roads, etc. It's challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to get cut off for time here. So, Rachel, if you want to mention the sharing resources.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We're going to be sharing the slides and recorded video of this conversation. And we'll also share some additional resources at the end through your emails. And we'll pass on the reports that Erin and Becca talked about once they're published as well. So we thank you all for taking the time and hope that you'll join us again in a future webinar.